Welcome to the Faith and Culture Now podcast. I'm Dr. Scott Shiffer, and today I am honored to be joined by Dr. Alan Streett. So, Dr. Streett, good to have you here.
It's good to be with you, Scott. You're one of my favorite people.
Oh, thank you. Well, you as well for me. You've been a kind friend and mentor in the academy for a number of years, over a decade now, and you have written several books. And all of your books, I feel like, have been great contributions to um, Baptist theology and scholarship. But I also want to talk to you today about your newest book that comes out October 31st. Is called Exploring the Paranormal. And so this book is different than your other books, but it is also more accessible to pretty much everybody, not only in the Christian community, but even outside the Christian community who are interested in any kind of spiritual matters. And so I wanted to begin by just asking you if you could just tell a little bit about why you chose to write the book and sort of what some of your thoughts are behind what the, I guess, intended purpose of it is for the readers.
Well, Scott, I felt I had a story to tell. And my story goes back for 50 years, and it involves exploring the paranormal, including psychic phenomena and spirituality of all types. And over that time, my thinking evolved, and I thought I had some new stuff, I think based on fact and scientific research, to share with the people. So it's basically my story and and some of the conclusions that I've come to.
Yeah. Well, I think that many people are interested in sort of the paranormal or the spiritual aspects, the spiritual side of humanity. And uh, you know, at one point I kind of wondered in my academic career, is interest in, in tarot or, psychic readings or other stuff like that, is it kind of waning? Is it going away? And I'm on TikTok, and TikTok does this sort of algorithm thing. They have me figured out pretty well. I get a lot of videos of people breaking OSHA laws and stuff like that. But I also get a lot of videos from atheists and videos from Christians. And I frequently see people doing tarot card readings, and I see other stuff coming up on social media. One of the initial things that happens, of course, when evangelicals see that is they automatically assume, oh, this is demonic, stay away from it. And um, but me being the sort of curious person that I am, sometimes I'll kind of watch and kind of figure out what's going on. Um, and in your book, you do a great job of sort of tracing the history in America, at least, of a lot of this interest and kind of where it began in the 1800s or before up into today. Um, what are some of the things that you've seen in your own ministry and life that sort of tells you that there's still a lot of interest in these topics just in general?
Well, Scott, this may surprise you, but I really didn't think there was that much interest. But my publisher said this is a big area right now, and especially spirituality and paranormal among younger people. I
Hmm.
did not know that. When I submitted this manuscript to the publisher, I simply wanted to tell my story. I thought I had a story to tell that could help people, and I knew a lot of it dealt with history. Uh, but when he said that, that made me think, okay, we need to deal with some of these other areas. And so I brought in, like you say, tarot cards, psychic readings, trance mediumship, and all that. So I'm sort of surprised. I was surprised. I'm still am surprised that people who seem to be logical in a modern era would fall for that stuff, but they do. And especially in the area of spirituality, there's all kinds of spirituality that people are getting into, meditation, things like that. They're not necessarily Christians. And when Christians hear that maybe one of their neighbors, who may not be a believer, has been meditating or doing yoga or whatever, their
Right.
hands fly up and they're scared and say, "Oh, you have to watch out for that." And I do have a body of knowledge and experience over the years that tells me that that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah. I think that I mentioned, you mentioned psychics, and I think, I drive around town and I see an old building where a psychic used to work, and it's in disrepair, and I think, oh, people just aren't going to these places. But it turns out that they've moved their businesses to the web, and people are interacting more on social media platforms with these kinds of folks than they are in your traditional brick and mortar shops,
Right.
just like everything else in the country. I mean, you have more shopping done online now. And so I think sometimes it's a bit misleading to think that these things are dying out when in reality, they've just sort of changed their mode of transportation.
Right. Yeah,
And
it's very interesting that when you looked at in the old days, when you looked at a psychic, let's say, cottage, and you'd see a gypsy's head, a picture of a gypsy's head on a sign, or a palm, or an astrological sign, usually you looked at that building and it was in disrepair. It
Mhm.
was old and run down, and you would say, well, if they were psychics, why aren't they living in luxury? Would they
Right,
know?
right.
Why are they so poor? That says a lot about psychic phenomena in America. But you're right, these same people who could hardly make it in brick and mortar situations
Mhm.
have now gone online, and people don't know who they are. They're willing to pay money to have their palm read or their astrological chart, cast or whatever. And so, yeah, it's growing again. And maybe because there's a spiritual vacuum in America, and people are hunting for reality, spiritual reality.
Yeah, I think they want to grasp on. I mean, I think there's this innate sense, innate belief in people in general that there's something more to life than just
Mhm.
what you see on the surface. And if we're not finding it here, maybe it's over there. And so I think you're absolutely right. There's this big vacuum, and people are just sort of looking for stuff. To that end, people experience spiritual phenomena across many religious practices. And that's something you deal with in your book. But can you maybe explain why religious experiences and supernatural, experiences take place in many different faiths?
Because each faith claims to be supernatural. And, there are a few that would be sort of agnostic or types of religions, don't believe in anything, maybe humanistic type of religion. But most religions claim to have some sort of, or claim to be in touch with the supernatural. And so you would expect for them to have supernatural experiences. Many religions were based on a supernatural experience. For example, Mormonism is based on Joseph Smith's claim that he had a vision,
Hmm.
and the whole religious basis for Mormonism is this supernatural experience. And even Mormon missionaries, when they come to share their gospel with people, they say, well, you just need to pray and ask God to give you a burning in your heart, and he will
Right.
reveal to you that Mormonism is true, for example. And
Hmm.
so people pray, and suddenly they have some sort of experience, and they are converted to this particular faith. So it doesn't surprise me that most religions have some sort of supernatural element. What is interesting is that people outside of these faiths are beginning to seek the supernatural element.
Hmm.
In other words, they say, I don't, when I go to church, I don't see anything supernatural happening.
Yeah.
If there's a God, there has to be more than this. And they
Hmm.
begin to seek. And I really wish the Christian church would start practicing what it preaches. They believe in miracles. They should be praying for the sick. Why don't you think that once in your lifetime you should at least see one person healed in church service? Why is it?
Sure,
It
sure.
doesn't happen. But
Yeah.
you go to these faith healing meetings and psychic healers, people get up and they say they've been healed. Now, whether they have or not, that's another story. But
Yeah.
it shows you they're going where they feel they can get some help.
Indeed. You mentioned Mormonism. I feel, very strongly that it's sort of the same with Islam. Muhammad had these visions in this cave, not that dissimilar to Joseph Smith.
Mhm.
And of course, then he was told to write this sort of additional writing down outside of the typical or, traditional Bible, right?
Mhm.
I
That's
mean,
correct.
uh, to a point. I mean, the Bible wasn't bound like King James bound, by then, but you had the
Sure.
gospel. You already had all these, letters and other things being passed around from the churches.
Right. And
And
interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
oh yeah.
when you think about many Muslims who are converted to Christianity, they come on the basis of the fact of having a vision. They say
Mhm.
Jesus has appeared to them, and they're converted to Christianity through something.
Yeah, that's right.
So there are a lot of people that have had experiences, and when we just label them demonic or label them as fake, we're doing a disservice to those people's testimony because they say they've had an experience and it's changed their lives in one way or another.
Mhm. Absolutely. And speaking of personal experiences, your book mentions a number of personal experiences you've had with meditation, with mentalism, and other things of that nature. Um, can you talk a little bit about your own experiences and sort of how they shaped getting you to where you are today with how you see these kinds of experiences?
Well, it's very interesting. I got involved in psychic phenomena when I was maybe 21 or 22 years old. I was hoping to have a professional baseball career, and I had scouts coming out into my games. And in my junior year, into my junior year, I injured my arm, and I injured it so severely that I could not even throw a ball from home to second base. I was a catcher, and if you can't throw a ball and you're a catcher, you're in trouble. And so
Absolutely.
I went to my doctor. They did cortisone treatments. I tried everything, chiropractic. I even went to the racetrack and got horse liniment and rubbed it on my arm, hoping that that would work. Figured if it worked for horses, it might work for me. It didn't.
Yeah.
It didn't work. Uh, and in those days, this reveals a little bit about my age. I lived in an age when they didn't have MRIs yet, and so if the doctor wanted to find out what was wrong with your arm, they had to go in and operate. It was called an exploratory operation.
Hmm.
And I was afraid of dying on the operating table. I had a terrible fear of death for some reason. I don't know why, but I did. And so my mother, of all people, had just read a book on psychic healing. And there was a psychic in our area who was world famous. People came from all over the world to have her lay hands on them and pray. And her name was Olga Warhol. And my mother said, "Why don't you go see Olga?" And I just sort of said, "Oh, come on. I don't believe in that stuff." But I wanted to sign a baseball contract and I wouldn't be able to if my arm wasn't healed. So in desperation, I went there.
Hmm.
And she laid her hands on me and nothing happened. But she sort of took me under her wing and said, you need to start reading books on psychic phenomena. And she introduced me to different occult practices. And it sort of drew me in. Although my arm wasn't healed, it drew me in. And I started going to these psychic meetings. And I heard testimonies of people who did things that looked like biblical miracles. In fact, they used the Bible as the basis for the things they were doing.
Hmm.
They would, for some of them, said they communicated with the dead. I thought, well, that's crazy. And they said, well, Jesus communicated with Moses and Elijah. He spoke to the dead. Can't we speak to the dead? Doesn't the church teach the communion of saints?
Hmm.
What is communion of saints if you can't communicate with them? Don't the Catholics actually pray to saints? People who lived on earth and now they're dead. So all these
Yeah.
things made sense to me. I just got drawn in further and further and further. And then I went to seminary, believe it or not. Well, first, actually, what happened is that I wanted to know more about all this kind of stuff. And so I began to read books and all this kind of stuff. But eventually, to make a long story short, I ended up going to seminary. And when I went to seminary, I met a man who was a trance medium who would go into trance and supposedly speak to the dead. And I got drawn into spiritualism. So it just was from one thing to another. And
Hmm.
I've seen psychic healings. I've gone to seances where supposedly I talk to the dead. That sounds crazy. When I look back on my life now, I say, I can't believe I did that. But
Hmm.
I actually did that. I believed that I was communicating with someone on the other side through a trance medium. So I've had all these experiences. I meditated, uh, trying to for purposes of spirituality and for purposes of physical health. I've just done it all. I mean, if you want to ask me about specific things, I can tell you, but I got drawn into that, you
Yeah.
know. and I thought it was real. I thought I was intelligent. I was a college graduate, and I was in seminary doing these things.
Do you think that Olga and maybe others, as you had these experiences, felt like, hey, if we can get him to sort of learn about this, then it'll be easier for him to believe what is happening and maybe see more results? Or like, I guess my question is, how do you sort of see the people who are in leadership roles around you, sort of guiding you? Um, how do you see them sort of trying to mold and shape you into these beliefs?
Well, people like Olga, I would put in the classification of people who are sincere, and they're not fakers, but they actually believe that what they're doing is through supernatural power. For
Mhm,
example, Olga believed that God used her hands to heal people. Her father was a Russian theologian. They're very religious people. She would say, Jesus Christ is my savior. So she
mhm,
wasn't some, faker.
sure,
So she really thought that what she was teaching was the truth. And she wanted me to learn these things.
mhm,
And my other friend, who was a trance medium, was the same way. He was a Methodist minister. He was converted and got involved in psychic phenomenon, and he thought that he was doing the things that Jesus did. He would lay hands on the sick, and some of them were healed. And so when those people were preaching, quote, their gospel, they were doing it with sincerity.
yeah,
So it wasn't they were trying to lead me down the wrong path. They wanted me to know the truth. And
mhm,
I had a hungry heart and I was open to their suggestions.
yeah. When it comes to people having religious experiences across the spectrum, in New Age movement stuff and in shamanism or whatever, right? I think that most people don't go into that thinking this is foolish and I'm just gonna jump on the bandwagon and try to fool people. I think a lot of people do tend to be sincere, and to your previous point about the sort of the spiritual vacuum. I mean, people are looking for something to be true, to hold on to.
Right.
And to that end, a lot of people have these religious experiences in many different kinds of faith. My question, I guess, to follow up on that is, um, does that make all faiths valid? Or if not, or if so, how do you determine whether the experiences are in fact genuinely real or not, despite whether you believe them?
Okay, let's assume that the person's not a faker. I believe a lot of these professional psychics that are on television and online are just in it for the money.
Hmm.
They're trying to dupe people out of their money.
Sure.
But let's say a person indeed has had a spiritual experience and they have no religion or they are of another religion. And they claim that in the experience they experienced God. They had an encounter with the divine. I have no problem with that. I believe that anybody can have an encounter with God. Uh, it has nothing to do with necessarily your religious background, but that's not salvation. And we
Hmm.
need to make that clear. Look, you can belong to a religion that's a cult. You can belong to a world religion other than Christianity and have an experience that's real. Let's assume for a moment that Muhammad had a real experience. And that's what he says he had. Let's take it on face value that he did. He
Hmm.
had a real experience. That doesn't mean he's saved. That
Sure.
doesn't mean he's been converted. That just means he's had an encounter with God. A lot of people have had encounters with God, but it doesn't necessarily change their life. And sometimes it does. And then you have to look at the fruit of their life and see where they go. So
Hmm.
I don't have any problems with other religions having experiences. The question is, from a Christian standpoint, have they pledged their allegiance to Jesus Christ and his kingdom? And if they have not done that, I think they're heading down the wrong avenue
Hmm.
and they are misinterpreting their experience with God as the act of salvation.
Hmm. That makes sense. Um, to that end, how do you think Christians should view the paranormal and mystical experiences?
Well, I viewed them different ways throughout my lifetime. At first, I thought all spiritual and psychic phenomena was indeed from God. And then, crazy thing was, I had a professor at, at my college who shared the gospel with me. And he told me that I needed to pray a prayer and ask Jesus into my heart. And I did that. Nothing happened. I didn't have any experience, but it got me on a road to search for truth. And I began to go to a little Bible school in the evenings. And I learned all these things about the Bible. They had a course in Romans, they had a course in systematic theology, and I took these courses. I wasn't a believer, but I was interested in this.
Hmm.
And then one day I went to the dean at the University of Baltimore and I asked him, he was a former minister, and told him of my experiences. He said, "Well, you ought to go to seminary." And so I applied to seminary and got accepted. I was still involved in the occult and psychic phenomena at that time, studying the Bible and practicing the occult. I saw no contradiction at all. And then one day, I had an encounter with God that was so supernatural. I had a radical conversion experience. I don't need to go into all the details, but my life was absolutely changed, and I sold out to Jesus Christ.
Hmm.
And somebody invited me to a charismatic church meeting. And when I went there, that guy talked on the occult that night. And the preacher said, "If you've been involved in this, you've been involved in demonic activity." He said, "These are all counterfeit gifts." So suddenly there's a change in my life. I have gone from looking at psychic phenomena as coming from God. After my conversion, I've been told it was demonic and I needed to denounce it. And I did denounce it. Well, after I get some more education, I am hired as a professor, and at Criswell College, in fact, in
Yes,
Dallas,
yes.
Texas. And that's where I met you. And I taught classes on world religions and cults. And one day I had uh, a magician come into the class who knew how to do psychic tricks. And he did some things. And he said, "By the way," we talked after the class, and he said, "I want you to know that this psychic stuff is not necessarily from the devil, and it's certainly not from God. Most of these people are tricksters. They know how to do magic tricks of the mind and fool people." And I began to research that, and I came to the conclusion that he was right. And I labeled everybody in psychic phenomena as a faker, somebody who was out to get rich. So I've
Yeah.
gone through an evolution.
Hmm.
See? And then, lo and behold, one day I'm listening to a radio program and I hear about the power of the subconscious mind, that the mind can do things that are unbelievable. Looks like miracles. Uh, and if we can just tap into our subconscious mind, we can see things that appear to be supernatural. And I thought, well, that's a different concept. And I discovered the power of mind over matter. And here was the story that really, I guess, drove the point home. There was a man named Mr. Green, and you will remember this in the book. He was in a hospital with a failing heart condition. He actually only had a couple of weeks to live. It was so severe. And the doctor came around on his visits, and he had a group of interns with him on his rounds. And he looked at Mr. Green's chart, and he looked at his interns, and he said, "Mr. Green has a galloping heart." And they all nodded. And then they left the room. Mr. Green, who's on the edge of death, says, "If I have a galloping heart, my heart must be getting stronger like a horse." And immediately he grabbed his clothes, got up out of bed, and walked out of the hospital and never came back. And he lived for several years. Well, the thing was that a galloping heart in medical terms doesn't mean your heart's getting stronger. It actually means your heart's getting weaker. It's one
Uh-huh.
of those crazy things. And all the doctors knew that Green had only a few days to live. But he misinterpreted the words, and something clicked in his mind. It triggered faith, and suddenly he was healed. His mind healed his body, mind over matter. And I said, wow, how did that happen? And by the way, I don't put this in the book. Maybe I do in a footnote, but that doctor went on to win a Nobel Prize.
Hmm.
This is a very reliable story. And I heard this story being told on this radio program. And that caused me to begin to study the power of the subconscious mind and the power of faith to heal. If a person can say something that triggers faith in you, suddenly you can do things that are almost miraculous. And so I began to study that, and then I came to the conclusion that guess what? Okay, there's some things that look like they're supernatural or certainly paranormal that are the result of the power of the subconscious mind or mind over matter or faith being triggered. Yes, there are some cases where it may be demonic. Yes, there are people out there who are fakes. And yes, there is real healing that God can do.
Hmm.
So I've sort of gone through an evolution in my
Yeah.
thinking. And I think most of what's happening that we would dub paranormal has to do with the mind. It's the way the mind processes things and triggers faith. And also, if you remember in the book, I deal with brainwave
Hmm.
levels. And we know that when we are during the daytime, our brain is very active. And the electrons in the brain move at a certain speed, a very fast speed. It's called the beta speed. And that's when you're doing calculations, you're figuring things out. But your brain can't operate at that speed forever. It has to take a break. And when it does, the brain waves slow down to what's called the alpha state. And that's when you start having daydreams. You start thinking about going to the beach, and suddenly you you don't even see your eyes are open, but you don't see anything in the room. You see the beach.
Yeah,
you
yeah.
might, yeah. And somebody says something to you, you don't even hear what they're saying. You hear the waves pounding at the beach. So even though your eyes are open and your ears are open, your senses aren't working. What is working is your mind, and you're having an altered state of consciousness. Your
Hmm.
subconscious is kicked in. And we know now that during the alpha state, that is when certain psychic events occur in a person's life. They may have a vision. It's during the alpha state that they have a vision. They say
Hmm.
that vision's from God, but it's simply a product of their mind. And people have, so anyway, what I'm saying is that your brain, we're just learning about the brain and
Hmm.
its power to produce what seems to be paranormal phenomena in a person's life.
Yeah. And I would say that, at least if I gather correctly from your book, um, some of these things that happen with the brain waves, even if they don't happen in reality, doesn't make them any less real experiences.
That's correct. So one of the examples when you're going into sleep and coming out of sleep, you go into what's called a theta state. And there are people who, when they wake up in the morning, suddenly they feel like some evil entity is on their chest trying to choke them.
Hmm.
And they cry out, "Help, Jesus, help!" Or they cry out something. And then suddenly it goes away. Well, we know now that that is a product of the theta brainwaves state.
Hmm.
That's a 25% of people in the world have an experience like that. Or they'll see
Right.
when they're going to sleep at night, suddenly they look out and there's some dark figure over in the corner of the room. That happens during the theta state. It's not real in the sense that there's a real person there or
Hmm.
there's a demon on their chest choking them. It's just something that the brain can produce in the theta state. And then we know when we're in the deep sleep at night, which is the delta state, wow, you can solve problems while you're sleeping. I
Hmm.
tell in the book about a man who writes a best-selling song while he's asleep. Charles Spurgeon wrote a sermon while he was asleep at night. Uh, it seems like
Hmm.
something that's supernatural, but it's how the brain processes things.
That's right. And it reminded me when I started reading that section of your book, it reminded me of a study I'd seen a couple years ago where they were talking about alien encounters and brain waves and determining that many people who have these feelings of floating and spinning and people standing over them like they're on a ship or something are actually in one of these brainwave states where they think they're being, prodded or whatever, and it turns out that it's just all in their mind, but
Okay.
it seems so real that they couldn't distinguish it from reality.
Right. And here's, in the last volume of the Harry Potter series, uh, Harry Potter dies. I think he maybe is killed by his mortal enemy.
Mhm.
And he goes into the ethereal world, which looks just like Harry Potter world on Earth, but it's now in the ethereal world. And he talks to his mentor, and he says to his mentor, "Was all of this real, or was it in my mind?" In other words, all the things that happened in those 7 volumes was were these things real, or were they in my mind? And his mentor says, "Of course they were in your mind, but that doesn't make them less real." So these things are real, but a lot of it is produced through the mind, and we will attribute it to the devil. Some
Mhm.
people will attribute some people will attribute it to God. Some people say, "Oh, they're faking that. They really didn't have a vision." But they really did have a vision. The question
Mhm.
is, what's the source and nature of the vision?
Right, right.
Is it, and that doesn't mean God can't use those
Mhm.
situations. Maybe that's how God chooses to communicate with us, through our mind at
Sure.
times.
I had also read another story a number of years ago. Well, actually, there was a guy named Kurt Koch who was a German psychologist type guy who talked about always, casting demons out everywhere he went, and you may have heard of him and heard of some of his stories. But um, you know, things like looking into like brain waves and stuff like that, really it raises red flags on for me for people like him in those ministries
Right,
where they're saying, oh yeah, they just, they would walk into a mental hospital and half the people would leave healed the next day. And I'm
right,
going, well, they might have left healed because of what the, this placebo effect or whatever, but
right,
what,
right.
like, did they stay out or did they have to end up going back? And when they did get out, like, what happened next? And, the
Now,
mind is a powerful thing.
I am very familiar with Kurt Koch, and even when I never believed totally what he said. It just didn't ring true.
Uh-huh.
But I've had an experience or two with what we call exorcism. There was a guy I used to have I was involved in a parachurch ministry, an evangelistic ministry. We had big rallies. And I had a guy on my board of directors uh, who was a very faithful Christian man, good Christian man. And the night before, we had a rally, and I had a speaker in, and his name, believe it or not, was Charlie Brown. Sounds great. But I got up to introduce Charlie Brown at this big rally, and I said, "Here's a prophet of God, Charlie Brown." And he spoke and gave an invitation and so forth. Well, the next day, Charlie Brown happened to be staying at my house over the weekend. The next day, the guy who was in my board of directors came and started banging at the front door, screaming, "I want to see the prophet! I want to see the prophet!" We had no idea. I mean, I was upstairs shaving, and my wife answered the door, and he breaks in. He's glassy eyed, and he said, "I want to see the prophet." She calls, and I come downstairs, and uh, this guy is going crazy. And Charlie and myself, we dealt with him and thought he was demon possessed.
Hmm.
We dealt with him for 3 hours, casting out demons. He got on his hands and knees. He glared. He grunted. He said, "You're not going to get me. I've got my," he mentioned his name, "I've got Neil, and he's mine forever. He's a son of Satan." And this was coming out of this guy's mouth. And we're trying to cast devils out of him. And we were exhausted. We were sweating by the end of 3 hours. Now, we weren't nuts. We were just normal people trying to get these demons out of him.
Right.
We finally took him home. His wife thought she was scared to death. Well, who are these people? And she finally took him to a hospital or to a psychiatrist, and he gave him lithium.
Mhm.
Actually became normal again. Didn't have the demons anymore. All the demons were gone. Now, I don't think lithium can cast out demons. We
Yeah,
tried
yeah.
to cast them out in Jesus' name, and it didn't work. But he gets this lithium and suddenly he's okay. Now, here's an example of a case where Kurt Koch would have said, this man was demon possessed. In reality, what he had is he was schizophrenic and
Hmm.
he needed medicine.
Yeah.
That was the solution for this guy's problem, you know. And so not everything is demonic. It was in his mind. He had something going on in his brain that was causing him to have visions and thinking this. He thought this guy who spoke the night before was an actual prophet. He wanted to talk to the prophet, you know. But he was not demon possessed. Now this was a good Christian man. You have to realize this is the first time I ever saw him act like this,
Hmm.
and a big supporter of the ministry. Uh, but the man had a problem. He had a psychiatric problem and he needed medicine. And so I think that we do a disservice when we label things that we really don't understand
Hmm.
as demonic.
Yeah, I don't know how many times I've heard someone say, in the middle of a church service or, whatever, they're praying and they say, and, God, we ask you to bind Satan out of this room. And I'm always thinking, I don't think Satan's here to begin with, I mean, there's only one devil, and my guess is nothing at this meeting is important enough to get his attention from,
Bring it all across the
yeah,
world wherever he is, right? To that.
right,
Yeah.
right. Uh, but uh, but you do see a lot of that kind of thought and the attribution of things to the demonic very quickly without really investigating and going, well, what's really going on here? And um, to that end, there was a show I used to watch called River Monsters. It's about a guy who goes fishing in places where things have happened, and he tries to figure out, well, what kind of fish or creature in this area could have, done this thing. And at one point in the show, he goes to this tribe. He said, I've heard that there's this tribe that, well, let me back up. In the show, in this particular episode, somebody had died and a couple people had died. And he thought, well, I think what's going on here is that there may be electric eels in this river that people aren't aware of. And so, sure enough, he was able to figure out that there were electric eels in that area. Not many, which is why it was rare for people to, come up missing, right? But it would explain why grown men are suddenly drowning, in these rivers. And when they're in there, fishing with their hands and whatnot.
Yep. Yep.
But then he goes to this tribe, and in this tribe, the people were known for fishing for electric eels with their hands and getting them and taking them out of the water and moving them. And they would always go through shamanistic rituals before they would go and do this.
Right.
And so he actually filmed one of these rituals and put parts of it on the show. And the shaman's doing some kind of potiony type stuff and saying things. There's sort of a ritual for it.
Right.
And he does some things with the guy's muscles on their arms before they go into the river, and then you see him pick up some of these eels and come out of the water with them. And the guy hosting the show says, well, what would happen if you did this to me and then I went in the river and grabbed one of these eels? He said, you would still die. And so he was like, we're not going to do this to you, but um, I wonder, looking back on that, like, how much of that is sort of the mind, they're put into this sort of um,
Alpha state is what
alpha
they're called.
state, through this ritual, and then their mind sort of overpowers the matter, and that's how they're able to go and do this.
Yeah. Well,
And so,
yeah, I mentioned in the book about snake handlers.
yeah.
And when the snake handler goes into a sort of altered state, an alpha state, they're able to pick up the snakes without any fear.
Hmm.
And and then if they do get bit, and the occasions they do get bit, it doesn't even hurt as much because they're still in this alpha state.
Yeah.
So yes, it's mind over matter. It gives them the ability to do certain things, and if we just don't, we're just beginning to scratch the surface of understanding all these kinds of. It's the same with faith. The power of faith is unbelievable. I tell in the book about Roger Bannister, who broke the 4-minute mile. First man ever to run a mile in 4 minutes. They said it couldn't be done. The human body couldn't do it, but he did it. He did it in 3 minutes and 57 seconds or something like that.
Right.
Within a month, 16 people had broken the 4-minute mile.
Hmm.
What? What? How did that happen? Well, they said, well, if Roger can do it, I can do it. And suddenly they believed they could do it. And they were able to do what before seemed to be impossible. So
That's
there
right.
it just shows you a power of the mind, in this case, faith, trusting that they can do it over the matter. She can do miraculous things just when faith is triggered. The problem is we don't know how to trigger faith. We can't just trigger it automatically. But
Right.
sometimes things can be triggered. Just like Mr. Green's faith was triggered when the doctor said galloping heart. He misinterpreted the statement even, but his mind accepted it and he walked out of the hospital.
You know, speaking of Mr. Green and his time in the hospital, one of the things that you also see a number of books published on is people's near-death experiences. And most of the time when people have these experiences, they experience heaven in some form or fashion. On occasion, you'll have people that say, "I experienced hell," and then it's a very different experience for them. But how do you think these sort of experiences of the afterlife or things like that correlate with understanding the brain?
I'm convinced, but I can't prove it, that all these near death experiences are brain activities. It's not that they really do have an experience of the afterlife.
Hmm.
And a lot of, so I don't know exactly what the brain's doing, but it's sort of like when you're in the theta state and you see somebody shadowy in the room, or you have a dream that you're in heaven when you're in the delta state. Uh, but I will say this, that the vision or whatever they're having, the near death experience vision, uh, will usually, or maybe always, uh, align with their worldview.
Hmm.
So if they believe that everybody goes to heaven, they see old Uncle Joe there, even though he was a drunk. So it's
Right.
he's there reaching out to them. So it shows you that whatever you have in your brain to begin with, what your
Hmm.
concepts are, oftentimes that if you have a near death experience, that's what you will see or you will envision.
Yeah, that makes sense. When people think everything goes into one, when they have these
Right.
experiences, they feel like they're just one with the universe.
One
Uh,
big light.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes people say, "Well, I saw so and so," and then the person on, this side will say, "Well, you shouldn't even know so and so.
Yeah.
How did you have that vision?" And I know in your book, in one place, you even talk about someone who felt like they had had past lives, like sort of reincarnation, and
Right.
they were able to sort of track that down to there was someone with that name who used to live across the street from them as a kid that they
Right.
had totally forgotten about.
Right. And it
And
was in their subconscious mind. They met this person, knew about their history, and then when they were put in a hypnotic state, the hypnotist regressed them back to a past life.
right.
They claimed to be that person who was across the street.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much of sort of that same kind of, these things in your subconscious, you hear your parents talk about Aunt so and so, but you never really
Right.
knew that person or pay attention. But then you have this experience and they show up because
Right.
they're in your subconscious mind. And I wonder how much that sort of plays into then people
Yeah.
believing,
I
oh, this
think a
person
lot.
really
Yeah.
did because they shouldn't have known that person.
Right. I agree. I think, and this is why it's so fascinating to me. The demon theory wasn't even, it's not really even fascinating when you think about it. That's sort of a simplistic answer. This is more fascinating. The power of the mind is unbelievable. The heal, literally to heal. This makes sense why, like Christian Science practitioners, you talked about people of different religions, they believe that you can be healed through your mind.
That's
And we
right.
and there was a time I would say, "Oh, don't believe any of that stuff. That's nonsense. That's some cult group, blah blah blah." And I would sort of condemn those beliefs, but I was speaking out of ignorance, and the reason I was speaking out of ignorance is I didn't know anything about the mind at that time.
Sure.
I wanted the simple solution. These people are demonic.
Exactly. And something that I think a lot of Christians struggle with is like the gift of tongues. Some people have the gift of speaking in tongues and some do not. A few years ago, I read a dissertation called Glossolalia and the Right Hemisphere of Brain. And they did a study on a large group of people who both claimed to have the gift of speaking in tongues and the gift of interpreting tongues. And they did so for people who were Jews, Christians, and Muslims, because believe it or not, people in other faiths also speak in tongues. And so this study sort of analyzes the way that people think, their personality traits, and all this kind of stuff. And they determined that people with certain proclivities are more inclined to speak in tongues than people without those same proclivities because of how their mind works. And
Right.
so when you find Christians today who are going, well, I don't know if I'm saved because I can't speak in tongues, they just don't have typically the right personality type based on the way that their mind works to actually have that gift. Uh,
Right.
and on the flip side, um, this particular study determined that no one who claimed to have the gift of interpretation, no two people ever interpreted the same person's speech the same way,
That's
which
great.
which also leads towards the idea of these guys think they have this gift, they
Yeah.
believe they have this gift,
Right.
but as it turns out, they're not quite as skilled as they think they are.
Right. So when you test it, you discover
Hmm.
that that's not the case. And that's the one thing about psychics. People who claim they have psychic power and turn it on and off, and well, when it's tested, it can't be duplicated, it can't be replicated.
Hmm.
Things have to be replicated, and they're not able to replicate these things. So that's why you have to be very suspicious of people who make claims. You know, uh, but yet, as I say in my book, there are some people that have intuitions that almost can, they have an intuition about certain things, and oftentimes they're right. Other people can't operate on the intuitive level.
I'll tell you what,
So,
I had a student that said to me, I'm going to turn that paper in next week. I would just believe them, you know, but they could tell me that in front of my wife and she would say, they're not going to turn that paper in.
yeah, she knew real
No.
quick.
But yeah, I think that this is a very, very timely, very interesting book that I think can help a lot of people. We're definitely in a place post-COVID, in this postmodern world, even where people are sort of trying to learn how to define their own truth and define what is true, where they're turning to all kinds of things. The amount of people I see looking at um, Reiki healing and things like that today is just it kind of floors me just how much of it is out there, how prevalent it is. And I think the last I read, there were over 12,000 practicing witches in the United States right now doing different kinds of Wicca and things like that. There's actually a lot more of this going on than what I think a lot of people realize.
Yeah,
But your book brings a level-headed approach to the spiritual, saying, "Hey, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to test things. Don't be afraid to see if this person here is a charlatan, is a fake, and don't be afraid to consider whether what's going on, what you're experiencing, is an issue related to your subconscious before just either labeling it as demonic, labeling it
right,
as fake, or labeling the person as just kind of a nut job out there who thinks
right.
they're experiencing things they're not."
And sometimes it's okay to say, "I don't know how that happened,"
That's right.
without judging it. You say you have the experience, great. Now, so what? you know, what does that mean?
Right.
Should we all have that experience? I mean, what does it mean? So we shouldn't judge. We don't have to judge. We don't know. People can have all kinds of experiences, and we don't. We can't. There's no way we can analyze them, but we don't have to judge them. We don't have to label them a fake or a
Mhm.
demonic person. They've had the experience, and I think that's an opportunity for those of us who are Christians. Say, "Oh, that's great. Well, I'm glad that you're seeking." And that gives you an opportunity to actually share the gospel
Yeah.
in a
And
positive way.
I think oftentimes we approach that with fear, right? Oh, they had this experience. What if they're possessed by a demon? Now I can't talk to them or something,
Right.
right?
Right.
And in reality, we have the Lord of all creation indwelling us. We have no need to be afraid of the demonic, and we have no need to be trepidatious in just saying, let me share God's kingdom with this person who's
Right.
clearly seeking and who has an open mind and an open heart to things outside of the realm of this physical existence.
Mhm. Scott, many times I've had parents come to me in the days when I was teaching cults, and they would say, "My daughter has gotten involved in," and they will say cult A, B, C, or D. It doesn't matter what it was, but we'll just
Mhm.
use something. Let's say Jehovah's Witnesses or whatever. It doesn't really matter.
Sure.
And they'll say, "We're so concerned about it. We don't know what to do." And they were wringing their hands. What can we do? And I would say, first of all, I want you to know that that's not a bad thing. First of all, and this is just an aside for the audience, her daughter wasn't interested in church at all prior to
Mhm.
that. But now, guess what? She's gone off to college, or she's gone out on her own, and she's gotten involved in some group, and they're wringing their hands. And I'm thinking to myself, well, Why didn't you raise her up the way she should have gone when she was a kid? I never
Right.
said that, of course. But I would always say to them, well, you know something, that's a good thing. It tells me that she's seeking. And if she's seeking, God will lead her ultimately to the truth.
Hmm.
And so I wanted the parents not to be so frightened about the girl or their son or daughter getting involved in a group. It doesn't. I said, by the way, that group's not going to kill her. It's not a group that's going to commit mass suicide. Her life isn't
Right.
in danger. But what you should be saying is, Lord, obviously she is seeking, lead her to the truth.
Hmm.
Bring somebody into her life that will lead her to the truth. Because many of us in the past, and I can attest this to myself, I was involved in the occult. Many of us started out in places maybe that were not orthodox, but we were seeking the truth. And look where we ended up. We ended up right in God's kingdom. So we need to be encouragers in that sense.
Yeah, definitely so. And I think that it sort of speaks to the way in which we need to trust God
Mhm.
and come to Him with our burdens for others, right? Instead of worrying so much and being anxious about what's happening, simply saying, you know what, God, you're in control of this, and this may be the first step on the path towards getting the person
Right.
into a proper relationship with you. And let's pray and look for opportunities to share Christ and other things like that, to help people
Mhm.
moving on that path towards salvation.
Mhm. Yeah. It was very interesting to me that these parents themselves were always nominal Christians. They were not really Bible Christians.
Sure.
But when their kid got into a cult, they began to study the Bible.
Mhm.
And they began to study who Jesus was. And now they're concerned. So it shows you that here God has used two things: the daughter getting involved in the occult, who's seeking truth, and now the parents, as a result of that, are seeking the truth.
Yeah, they're finally sort of getting serious about their
They're
faith.
getting serious, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, Dr. Street, I really appreciate you being on the Faith and Culture Now podcast. Is there any last final message or word you would want to share with our listeners about this topic, or even just about your book in general?
Well, Scott, I would like to say, number one, God is a big God, and He can do mighty things. And so often we limit God by our lack of faith. Uh, the scripture says in one place in Luke that Jesus couldn't do healing in a certain village because the people didn't believe in him. So we need to believe in a God who can do great things. That's number one. Okay. Greatest thing he ever did was send his son Jesus to die on the cross and then raised him from the dead. And you talk about a miracle of miracles. That's a miracle that he raised him from the dead and he sits at God's right hand. And he has given his son a kingdom, which is one day is going to spread across the face of the earth. And we can be part of that kingdom. And I want to encourage all the listeners to consider uh, making a commitment to Jesus Christ as the king of their life. Uh, that's what salvation is all about. But also, I would say to our topic is that people need to make sure they're not so judgmental. There are experiences that people have, and they're very meaningful experiences to those people. Even a near death experience, like you said, can be very meaningful. I saw my uncle, at the end of the tunnel when I was dying, but I came back. Well, guess what? Now they're back. Obviously, they're going to start seeking. So,
Hmm.
who better than you to share the light with them, that they're hunting for?
Right.
So, we shouldn't be so judgmental. We need to be uh, positive, and we need to be advocates for these people and leading them toward the truth. Uh, but I would want to say that people need to have a lot of. We don't operate on the level of faith that we should. I am very concerned about the condition of the churches today, especially in America.
Hmm.
We go through rote services. We sing three songs, jumping up and down. Preacher doesn't deal with the word of God that necessarily the way it should be dealt with. People go in and out, they go out and they get lunch after the service, and nothing changes.
Hmm.
And I really wish that I really feel that the church needs to get back in touch with New Testament Christianity and start trusting and asking God to send the Holy Spirit to move in the church because we need to see a real revival in our churches. And right now, I think our churches are in a bad spot.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I would just reiterate that you know, our our whole spiritual landscape in the United States right now is in a pretty dark space.
It is.
People are looking for truth and spiritual truth out there all over the place. And people in our churches are grabbing onto truth they see in the church and outside the church. And, one of the biggest issues in the Old Testament was the syncretism of God's called and chosen people and their willingness to gravitate towards things that pulled their allegiance away from Yahweh. And right now, I think in the American church, for a lot of churches anyway, the allegiance is not really to God.
No.
It's to their traditions, it's to their comfort, and to things being as they've always been. And I think that the church in America certainly is in need of the Holy Spirit's guidance, His leading, and I think that stronger faith, um, and more honesty and openness about where the church is at and where it needs to be are discussions that we need to be having on a regular basis to start moving the church in a direction that is in fact going closer to God's kingdom and not just keeping things the way they've always been. Well, for those of you listening to Faith and Culture Now, we always appreciate it. Dr. Alan Streett, thank you for being here. And
You.
again, his book is called Exploring the Paranormal, and it comes out October 31st. You should definitely get a copy. It is well worth your read, and it's only about 180 pages, which means you can probably get through it pretty quickly. It's not one of those 1,500 page volumes that I sometimes recommend on here for theology. So, Dr. Streett, again, it's been a real blessing and encouragement to have you on the show today. And for those of you listening, we will see you next time on Faith and Culture Now.